The first duty of government is to protect our rights.
It's our job to maintain the proper role of government and what we were tasked to do.
Obviously, we over budgeted last year. I hate to say that I was right, but I was right. So.
And I think that that's what we need to look at more, is trying to get back to what we used to be, where our churches and our families took care of each other instead of relying on the state.
And we have no way to maintain control over the spending of this program, and it will be a disaster for this state long term.
But we have a whole gamut of kids whose parents would like to do something for them and they cannot.
I take our constitutional rights, the constitutional rights of my constituents, very seriously.
This is simply about putting it out of reach of young, innocent, vulnerable children and making our libraries and schools a safe place for them to go.
And I am increasingly frustrated that we cannot stop ourselves from drinking at the public trough.
He's sounding the alarm. He's saying if we don't address these issues, we potentially might have greater problems moving forward.
Mr. Speaker, no matter how you look at it, no matter how you boil this down, there is never any time that a parent's right to govern what their children see and what they're exposed to should ever be bypassed.
If I was looking at a business and I was looking at these figures, there would be heads rolling because this is unsustainable.
We're supposed to be bottom-up government. We're supposed to be representing my citizens' ideas and your citizens' ideas, and we're supposed to be discussing them and debating them to come to a conclusion.
We need to start making Idaho first. We need to start making America first.
We need to be protecting our First Amendment rights, not inventing ways to slowly chip away at them.
The First Amendment and our freedom of religion, freedom of speech are our first liberties. They are so important. We don't have the rest without them.
Our consideration RS 32721, Representative Mickelson.
Representative Stephanie Mickelson, Legislative District 32, Bonneville County. What you have before you is a bill. Well, it's actually an RS that you've seen multiple times before. Some problems were brought to Representative Handy and I's attention concerning this, that we needed to have an off-ramp for members that might be currently serving so that they would be able to receive the stipend or the benefits that they were receiving through the end of their term. And other than that, it has not changed from the previous 2 or 3 iterations. Other than this just brings some additional clarification. So with that, I would entertain questions or ask for this RS to be introduced.
Thank you, Representative Mickelson. Are there questions for Representative Mickelson? Representative Achilles.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I move to introduce RS 32721 and move it to the second reading calendar.
Committee, we have a motion to introduce RS 32721 and send to the second reading calendar. Is there discussion on that motion? Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm just going to make a motion to introduce RS 32721 with no second reading calendar.
Committee, we have a substitute motion to just introduce RS 32721. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor of sending RS 32721 to introduction signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay? Nay. Ooh. Motion carries. It will be introduced. Had to keep you with bated breath this morning hanging on to that. Committee will now consideration. We're going to jump down and pick up House Bill 399. Mr. McGrain, Secretary McGrain.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, committee members. Thank you for the opportunity to be with you before. Let me start off. I believe on the agenda, and I'm going to speak to House Bill 399, but also there is an RS for a new version of this with some tweaks. So I'm going to try and juggle that a little bit as we talk. Hopefully that
yes,
works,
the intent is
Chairman.
to hold House Bill 399 in committee and then introduce and send to the second reading calendar RS 32713C1. So that's kind of the plan today. Representative Moyle is being held up, so we're going to let you go ahead and present.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just to orient everybody, This is the campaign finance legislation, so this is a very comprehensive bill. This is the one that we introduced a couple of weeks ago, I think, to the credit of the chairman, making sure there was time for this to percolate. I think that was your word. Giving a chance. We've had a lot of feedback, so there's been a couple of adjustments along the way. To start off, I know that reading through this can be challenging because one of the biggest things is this is a recodification of our sunshine laws. So you have two bills before you this morning, 398 and 399. The lobbying legislation is 398. The campaign finance is 399. Both of those comprise what we call our sunshine laws. So I think most of you as candidates are very familiar with the sunshine laws. A couple of things. This law, our current sunshine law, was a citizens initiative that was circulated in the 1970s. And if you've attempted to comply with it, you will understand that it reads like a citizens initiative from the 1970s. It also makes it difficult to enforce because it reads that way. It has not really, it's been updated and tweaked along the way, but it's really never had a substantial review to match kind of modern campaign practices in modern times. In addition to just being dated, lobbying and campaign finance are interwoven together in here. Even though they're similar, they're not the same thing. Furthermore, things like being a candidate versus being a PAC versus independent expenditures are very tightly interwoven. So we often get, and I'm sure our office has provided assistance to many of you or your political treasurers, lots of questions just trying to comply with this because it's confusing. That's the most common thing that we hear. And so part of this legislation, why you have a 40-page bill in front of you, is to separate out campaign finance from lobbying, and you'll see it's reorganized. So there's broken into parts. There's a part on candidates. There's a part on political committees. There's a part on other entities, which would be like independent expenditures, to make it easier to comply. So for all of you, presuming this were to pass, you would easily be able to go look at the candidate section and say, all right, here's the rules that apply to me. In addition, there's a number of cleanup things on some really basic stuff. So things like you shouldn't commingle your campaign finance money with your personal money. That seems like very common sense stuff. There's some deadlines, like when does a contribution apply to, say, the current election versus the next election. A lot of cleanup efforts along the way, and I'm happy to touch on those further. But overall, the reason we're here, and I know if Speaker Moyle was here, he would really like to highlight, is just how much more we're seeing in terms of campaign finance overall. So during the last election cycle, which all of you were a part of, there was over $17 million spent just in legislative races alone. Of that $17 million, about $7 million came from candidates. The other $10 million came from independent expenditures, PACs, and other activity. So we're seeing just more intensity in the campaign finance space. One of the challenges, going back to our dated laws, is just the transparency, being able to see what's actually happening in the process. I think all of you on some level can relate to this. I know there's differing PACs. This seems to be across the board that people have personal experiences with this. One of the challenges, I'll just give you an easy example right now. Under our current sunshine laws, at the end of the session, you guys wrap up. If someone starts running campaign ads against you as an independent expenditure, they don't have to report the financing of those ads until next January. They can go almost 9 months without even reporting anything. So yes, it will be reported, it will be transparent. It'll just be so long ago that you'll have forgotten that it even happened. Similarly, as we get closer to the election under our current laws, there's some clunky timelines and timeframes for some of this activity. This legislation really aims to increase transparency by increasing the frequency of reporting. So for example, for political committees, it adds in monthly reporting all the time. There's no on and off. So right now we have kind of the off years and the on years in terms of election reporting. This requires PACs just do monthly reporting all of the time. Additionally, it adds in, and I think this is the biggest thing of note, for any of those expenditures over $1,000, it adds 48-hour reporting for independent expenditures at any time. So go into my example, if an independent expenditure happens right after the session, it would need to be reported within 48 hours. Similarly, for candidates, it adds increased reporting. So in the off election year, instead of right now we go the whole year without reporting, it would go to quarterly in the off years, monthly in the on years like we currently have. So a lot of it is really just focused on that increased frequency. Similar to independent expenditures, we treat electioneering communications. So those are the references to a candidate in the 30 days before a primary or 60 days before a general election. We had 48-hour reporting for the electioneering communication. So I think all of that. Additionally, one other thing, and I know Chairman Crane, was of specific interest to him. Our office worked really hard to try and figure out how we could do this, but one of the things added to this legislation for independent expenditures is the ad library. So one of the biggest changes, and this really is a novel concept, Representative Mickelson approached us at the beginning of the session with the idea, was for those who are familiar on Facebook, so we can all think of Facebook ads. Facebook, since the 2016 election, you can now go look up any political ads you want, how much was spent on them. They have what's referred to as the ad library. What we're doing is on our campaign finance site through this, any independent expenditure over $1,000, in addition to reporting the $1,000 that was spent and who the money was from, all the normal stuff, you would also, the organization doing the independent expenditure would upload a digital version of whatever the expenditure was. So if it's a TV ad, there would be a digital version of that, a radio ad, a mailer, doesn't matter. You would be able to see. Often as candidates, you can appreciate, you hear about what's going on, but you're not on the recipient list of those attack mailers or whatever else is happening. And so this would provide the visibility. So in addition to the funding, you'd also get to see the actual artwork of whatever was done. I should note on here, disclosure statements, we specifically add in the language for the paid for by statements that are on your materials to make it clear. My vision really is this should be easy for you to comply with, but it also should be easy for the public. Transparency doesn't work if you can't actually connect the dots. So in an effort to connect the dots, it has very specific language to say how you list the paid for by. That way, when someone gets a mailing and they see it, they should be able to go to our website, search that name, and be able to pull it up, right? And so we just have clarity in terms of that piece. I'm going to save the best for last. In addition to all those things, we have restructured the fine structure in it. So the enforcement is another piece. To me, the focus of campaign finance should always be making it easy to comply. Our first goal, if you've ever called our office and talked to Peggy or Garen, their goal is to help you be successful in your reporting. And that's true for any entity that is reporting, is make it easy to comply. Then once we've done that, to make it transparent, that's where the database and the new campaign finance system really goes a long way towards making it more transparent. And then after that, all of those things, then we look at enforcement where it's necessary, right? Our goal is not to be a heavy hammer. Our goal is to add sunshine to the process. But there are instances where we do need to fine people. And right now our fine structure and the way that's written is ambiguous and difficult to manage. And I can say this not just for me, but I know my predecessors have struggled with it. There's a maximum fine of $250 for a candidate right now, a maximum fine of $2,500 for a PAC, but it doesn't say how you should treat those fines within there. We would like it to be much more formulaic for our purposes. So in this bill, we've added that in because there's a difference. Everyone can appreciate there's a difference between being fined for a $50 mistake versus a $50,000 mistake. And this actually incorporates that in there where it's a percentage, 5% of whatever the violation was, right? So that we are right sizing based on that because we've seen, and genuinely our office has seen $40,000 violations, and we've seen more often, we see little small violations, and we want to treat them correctly. So there's those parts. And then finally, and I presume this is where some conversation may be, is contribution limits. Idaho's contribution limits were originally established in 1995. It was after the governor's race in 94. The limits have not been adjusted since that time. So our current limit is $1,000 for most offices and specifically legislative offices, $5,000 for statewide offices. In the RS that will be printed, it will move from $1,000 to $1,500, so a $500 increase for legislative races as well as other local races, and then move from $5,000 to $6,000 for statewide races. The other addition in here, and I know this has brought a lot of conversation, is this idea of a trigger. So it does, the newest version does still contain the trigger, and it's an exemption to, or it's to increase the limits, or I can point to the page for you. So it's on page 12 towards the bottom on line 43. What this would do is if there were negative independent expenditures combined adding up to $50,000, that would allow you to request from the Secretary of State's office. You could contact us. We would validate that information within 24 hours, and you could raise your limits from that $1,500 up to $25,000 is what the current version has. It removed, originally it had self-funding in there. That portion has been removed from the earlier drafts. So it's only negative independent expenditures would allow for that limit. And the idea is it's a right to respond. I know the speaker cares a lot about this. It's the ability, we presume it would happen closer to Election Day in the midst of it. This gives you the chance to go back to a donor who's hit the maximum at $1,500 and ask for additional resources to be able to quickly raise money to respond to whatever attacks are happening. That's the notion that is behind it. I think I've hit the highlights, and I could go on forever on campaign finance, Mr. Chairman, so I will stop myself.
Thank you, Secretary McGrain. Are there questions for Secretary McGrain? Representative Mickelson.
Yeah, Secretary and Chairman, does this apply to out-of-state political action committees that come into our state and start placing ads and so forth? And how are they accounted for in here?
So a couple of things. Representative Mickelson, can you pull your microphone closer so people that are listening can get the audio?
Does this apply to out-of-state PACs? And if so, can you point us to where? And can we make that apply to out-of-state PACs or out-of-state independent expenditures?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mickelson, yes. And I should have highlighted that. Yes, this does. Any political committee, so regardless of location, whether it's Arlington, Virginia or Boise, Idaho, must register and file with the Secretary of State's office under the provisions both for political action committees as well as independent expenditures. They must file with our office. So we've completely removed and overhauled that to ensure that we're treating everyone the same. The one exemption to that is the federal delegation. So obviously we don't regulate federal races, and we have a carve out for the federal delegation leadership PACs. But beyond that, it doesn't matter what the organization is. Yes, they would have to file with us. And under the independent expenditure provisions, which are in Part 4, let me get to, we actually have it to that, say an organization, say they're a national organization and they come into Idaho, they're going to participate, they start doing independent expenditures. They have to provide the donors from basically for the last year in terms of that information. So if they haven't been, so they have to, in addition, we had to put a time stop to it. So we just say the last year, they have to provide all their donors for that information. Yep.
Follow up?
Yes, follow up. Okay, I guess another one of my concerns is I feel like that we have some bad actors that come into Idaho, and because our fines are so minimal, they only get their hands slapped. I don't see anywhere where we have a kind of a stepped up escalating fines for bad behavior, multiple bad behaviors. Is there some way we could possibly address that in this RS before we move it forward?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mickelson, under the fine structure, I will say, as I mentioned, it is overhauled so that the fines will, rather than $1,000, if you have a larger fine, you will see larger fines in it. In the earlier version, we did have a doubling of fines within 60 days of the election. That's been removed based on the feedback that was received. We do have, for multiple violations, it can trigger the criminal provisions that are in here. So it depends on the nature of the fine. And fines, and this teases it out in this legislation. So fines start on page 25. There's a difference. So you'll see like on line 24 on page 25, you'll see late. So there's a difference between late fines. And this actually is easing the burden on late fines. Right now it's $50 a day. $50 a day can add up really, really quickly. This puts it at $50 plus $10 a day at a maximum of $1,000 for late fines. This is just like you didn't report a 48-hour. But in terms of other penalties, it is that 5%. Let me get to it. Sorry, I'm trying to navigate on the fly. There you go. Thank you for your assistance, Representative Achilles. So there, the next section right underneath it. other fines. So it increases, it can for multiple violations. There is a difference between like not reporting versus reporting inaccurately or other things. And so we worked off this. I will say one of the things, the major reference points for drafting this language was looking at the FEC, the Federal Election Commission, because they enforce a ton of fines and they are more threatening for, I think that goes to the essence of your question. So trying to amp ours up, but it is not necessarily as big as what we'll see in some other states that have much higher fines.
One more question. Do
Certainly.
we have an ability to send a cease and desist should somebody repeatedly mock and not regard our election laws anywhere in this legislation?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mickelson, yes, we have that in the current law and in this. And we have done cease and desist letters worth the AGFS from our office.
Representative Dygert.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Crane, just to follow up on Representative Mickelson, could you walk me through the enforcement process for the out-of-state PACs that aren't following our election laws?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Dygert, so what we're doing is clarifying. So to give some background, up until last session, and someone can correct me on that, we used to have an exemption in our statute for any entity that was registered with the Federal Election Commission that they didn't have to file anything with our state. So it wasn't even that they were violating laws. We just had a giant carve out that any PAC, and so most of the organizations that we see from outside the state are registered with the FEC. We removed that exemption last cycle. We put in rules to provide guidance on how they report. To say the least, it could be done better, which is hence here. So what we're doing is treating them the same as we treat PACs within Idaho. They must report their donors. If they're going to do a mailing, say a mailing in your race, they must report on the Secretary of State's page, not the FEC, the money that they've raised and the money that they've spent within the state. And then the violations would be the same penalties.
Follow up?
Yes, please follow. So does Idaho possess the leverage then to actually enforce on them or get the fines or tell them to stop, or are we going to travel to whatever state to go find them?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Dygert, we have the same abilities we have for the others. I will say we haven't had to test it. Those entities that we have worked on enforcement, last week I was on the phone with a national entity. We send out letters and they've been responsive. I'll give you a really good example. We are very actively investigating right now those emails, the fraudulent emails that some of you receive from constituents. We've received all the emails from LSO. We are actively working with Civic Clicks, the organization, and going back and forth, and they've been very responsive as we've been working on the investigation. So far, we're in there. We have not been fully tested to the degree that I think your question goes to.
Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary McGrain, my concern is more of the grassroots, regular citizens who want to participate and how complicated this is. And so I'm looking at page 20, I'm looking at page 22, and it's line 22, and it says, in the case of electioneering communications totaling less than $1,000, the report shall be filed the 10th day of the month, and then it continues on. And so then it goes back to page 21. It references another part of code. So what I'm wondering is if you can explain how the average citizen that might have got together with the neighbors and wants to take out a candidate, and so they raise like $2,000, what does that look like for the grassroots groups or that want to stop a levy or something like that?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, that's a great question. And in all honesty, you've touched on where like the toughest kind of grouping is. When we see really big dollars, which I know is where a lot of the conversation focus is, they usually have lawyers and people to help them ensure compliance. But when we see small groups, so I can think of a specific example from the last election where it was a group of friends and neighbors who were engaged in the process. I think first and foremost is anybody listening should contact our office, because again, our goal is to help compliance and help people ease through it. I will say this version through this bill is still much, much easier to follow and comply with than our current laws. These are really confusing for people to try and navigate because the PACs and the candidates and all the information are interwoven together. So part of it in this is we've restructured it. So let's say the group would say, oh, it sounds like you're forming a political committee. Here's the political committee section and what you need to know. There will be monthly reporting. Here's how you register on our site. So we can go through that. I will note, because you touched on the electioneering communication piece, first and foremost, all of this only applies to people spending money in politics. So somebody who's just very, very active on social media or going to rallies or doing this is not regulated, and that's free speech. There is no regulation of free speech in terms of the average citizen, because we get that question. This is really if you're spending money. So let's just use Facebook for an example. It's only if you're doing a paid ad on Facebook that this would apply. It has to be paid communications in order for any of this to be involved. And electioneering communication is a term of art. Most communication that's regulated in this space is you vote for, vote against, something of that nature. Electioneering communication, it comes from the feds. It's this idea that in the 30 days before the primary or 60 days before the general election, someone could put out information that is not saying vote for or vote against. It's very neutral in terms of position, but it just says, it just says Representative Scott voted this way on these bills. And, they've cherry picked which bills. It's saying, well, yeah, you didn't say vote for or vote against, but if we read into what your messaging is, it implies one or the other. And it's saying you have to report that information only in that time frame close to the election. That is part of us just being able to help people through it. And I will say, when we're working on enforcement, our first step is always to help people comply. I know that was a longer answer to it, but I do think this makes it easier for those groups to be able to know what the rules are as they approach it.
Follow-up?
Follow-up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, so what if your office gives bad advice? Let's just say they say, yeah, you guys, you didn't spend any money. You don't need to do that. But it sounds like they don't have to spend money if it's within 30 days. Is that what I'm understanding?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, it does require spending of money no matter when. Otherwise, it's not regulated.
Okay.
Follow-up?
That's it.
Okay.
Thanks.
Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We've talked around this area a lot, and I think it's focusing in, but I think even if an individual or a PAC or an organization or a couple of neighbors get together and try to educate about, let's say, a school bond or anything like that, what I'm hearing you say is that if they spend any money, then they need to contact you to see what direction they would go, whether it's education or any kind of advocacy at all. They need to talk to you, talk to your office to see whether or not they're going to fall within the parameters of this.
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Barbieri, I think that in essence, yes, it's either our office or the county clerk's offices. Especially, I think your bond and levy example is actually a perfect one, because that's, let's say there's a school bond in a group that's actually regulated and under here and currently by the county clerk's offices with our assistants, is just asked to make sure. It's really what we've determined as a state, and this goes back to the 70s, and I will say nationwide, pretty much all 50 states passed similar laws in the 1970s. This is on the heels of Watergate, is to say we need to know what money is being spent in politics. So whether it's a few $100s from a neighbor, now there are neighbors in our state that have modest means, and there are neighbors in our state that have significant means. We treat all Idaho citizens the same under this. It's just making sure that any of that money that is being spent, we've tried really hard with the new system to make sure it's easy for people to go on, set up an account. They can do it whatever hours on whatever weekend, get it set up, and all it is just making sure you're tracking it and reporting that information.
Representative Mickelson.
For a motion, I move RS 32713C1 to the second reading calendar, Mr. Chairman.
So just to help you out here a little bit, Representative Mickelson, we're on 399. So we have to take action on 399 before we can take up the
I move
RS.
we hold in committee H399, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, we have a motion to hold House Bill 399. Further discussion or questions for the Secretary of State? Representative Keelys.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, looking at section 743209, if we jump over to page 13, we've got this concept in here, and I do think the concept is good to respond to independent expenditure funds. But my concern is that we've got a $50,000 trigger. So this is page 12, line 47. which then unlocks maximum donations of up to $25,000. So this is page 13, line 9. It seems like that would be really easy to game. Somebody that can cut an individual $25,000 check to a candidate could really be in position to gain that IE threshold. And so the IE that $50,000 IE threshold just becomes now more of a hurdle that you just need to clear to unlock some huge checks. Am I interpreting this correctly?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Keeley's, I appreciate the question because I will say this provision is where we've gotten the most feedback out of the whole piece of legislation is the idea of the triggers. And I will say, talking to members across the rotunda, that $25,000 number is a big number. I think there's hesitation, I will say, by some members. A couple of things regarding the gaming. Like, we've tried to work through as best we can, trying to think through how this would work. This idea came from another state, a different format of this, but the same idea. One is we focus in specifically on negative independent expenditures. So an easy way to game it would be that you do positive, you just, the wealthy individual runs some independent expenditures and then opens up the triggers. Easy seeing how that would be gained. It focuses specifically on negative ones. I know one of the questions we received is our office ready to review and to make those determinations. When someone files, they do put for or against, but we can review them. And I actually think the combination of the upload of the digital files with this will really, the two kind of go well together, because it would be very difficult for us to make those determinations if we didn't have the piece of work to be able to review and to see. And so I think that combination allows us to be able to do it. Now, if you have a wealthy donor who's willing to attack you for $50,000 just so they can give you $25,000, I don't think that's going to be the problem. And so far too, I think it's worth noting, like, when we look at the actual amount of money that travels in the state and what donations are, there aren't as many big checks as people may perceive. The median donation during the last primary election was $200. The median donation during the last general election was $100. The average legislative candidate has about 7 to 9 maximum donations at $1,000. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind as we're looking at these limits, is how much money there is. I think the big thing right now is, because of our current limits, more money travels to political action committees, and we see that in the total dollars, where there's more activity there. And a lot of that is because candidates have reached the maxes in some instances. So we're trying to be responsive to what happened in the last cycle without trying to overreact, I guess.
Follow up? Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So, Mr. Secretary, is there any adjudicator process on this? So I get a bunch of negative IE stuff against me. I think it's negative. You guys think it's neutral. It's not so bad. They put a nice picture of you on the flyer. How do we resolve something like this?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Keelis, it doesn't automatically occur. You do have to request it, and our office has to review it. And I think that's how it's set currently. Having not gone through this process, I will say I do believe there are elements of this legislation. It's a big enough bill that we will likely be back before you in the future to make refinements to it, learning from the experience. I think we'll be able to determine, but I can see where we may disagree on what something is. So far, I will say, typically when we see in the political space, people don't pull punches when they're doing their negative attacks. No one is doing a light negative attack. At least that's what our observation has been. I think you've been subject to attacks. So I think we're prepared to try and navigate that, but that doesn't mean there won't be changes in the future.
Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary McGrain, so my question is, it has to do with the PACs being able to raise a certain amount. I think you've changed that to $2,500 in state races, and then the parties being able to do $10,000 per candidate. And so can you tell me your thinking on why you limited PACs over party? And I'm still going back to grassroots conservatives, and usually there's a PAC, conservatives for this candidate. And so now an establishment Republican Party candidate that may have been in office for a long time can get more money from the party than the actual grassroots PAC can give to the opponent. So can you explain your thinking on those numbers?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, just for clarification, there are no limitations on political action committees, and there's United States Supreme Court law. PAC contributions are unlimited, and that's not something that we have the ability to change or to regulate. It's been identified as a form of free speech. In terms of the party piece that you're identifying, because that's in there, that's not limits on what they can receive. So the political party, same thing as a PAC. A political party is a form of a PAC. They can receive whatever money. In the current law, and what we continued in this, is that the political parties are able to give double the amount. So that we just continued what the existing law is. We didn't change it. The only distinction there is, in addition to whether it's the state central committee, the county central committee, we also added in the political party caucuses. So the organizations in here, because they're in essence an extension of the political party.
Representative Crane, 12.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary McGrain. So I'm looking here on page 13, line 11, where we've got the $25,000. My concern is that we're going to create statewide legislative races that you're going to see ridiculously expensive. I mean, people are going to be buying these seats for $250,000, $500,000. Like, I'm worried that these everyday races are going to go up. How did you arrive at the $25,000?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, I will say I personally have hesitation with the $25,000. So I want to make that part clear. That is not my preference. So again, this has been a very cooperative, multiple parties involved, specifically Speaker Moyle. So I think that number, again, this is where we've heard the most feedback. If he was here, he would relate to his experience. He ended up experiencing $188,000 in negative attack ads spent in his race. And so that's where this really comes from. I think everyone's familiar with both the speakers, but also Senator Winder's race. There are about 10 to 12 races that would be triggered in that last cycle based on this legislation. Now, mind you, some of those are close to that amount, so I wouldn't be surprised. Going to Representative Keeley's question, I think where you could see people trying to game it is they'll just spend $49,000. They just won't go over the edge, right? Mm-hmm. That's what I would anticipate. What's tough is there is hesitation, and I've heard this through the bodies at large, just what do you do with the limits? There was a push to raise the limits even further. I think the more as this has percolated, as people have been like, whoa, how much money do we want to see? I will say I don't have too many constituents coming to me saying they don't think there's enough money in politics right now. And so I do think that this is a point of, probably one of the biggest points of conversation is what is that number? Because you would see it rise. Now, just because it rises, and I can point to races during the last cycle, let's say this law was in effect, I don't think those candidates have people who will give them $25,000. So just because the law is there doesn't mean that you have people lined up to give you that kind of money. Where we would probably see it is what we do now. The speaker's race this last cycle was almost $500,000 when you combine both sides to the race. And so we have a few races, but the average legislative race still, and hopefully most of you can relate to this, is still in the like $20,000 to $30,000 is what we see a candidate raise and spend. It just so happens in the recent cycles and the environment changing is that we've seen attacks up to $100,000, right? Or we'll also see, I should point out, there is still more positive independent expenditures than negative ones. They're a little bit more broadly spread out, but both exist.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So their loophole right now, or their workaround would be if this was to pass, that they go spend $49,000, and that keeps that candidate from being able to go and get the $25,000 fundraising match or whatever. Right.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Crane, yes, that is the case. It is combined though, so it doesn't have to be just one entity spending that. If one entity spends $25,000 and another entity spends $25,000, it's still you feel all $50,000, right? So it would open it. And I should note, it raises the limit for all candidates in that race. So not just the one candidate, it just raises the limits for the entire race.
That's helpful. Thank you.
Yeah.
Representative Mickelson.
Mr. Chairman, for a motion.
We already got a motion by you on House Bill 399 to hold.
So can we take action on that one?
So you would need to move for the previous question, but it's technically that motion's out of order in a committee. So no, this is part of the committee process. Representative Achilles.
I'll wait for the motion.
Okay. Committee, we have a motion to hold House Bill 399 in committee. Is there further discussion on that motion? I do not have anyone signed up to testify today other than Secretary McGrain. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to testify on House Bill 399? Seeing none, committee, the motion is to hold House Bill 399 in committee. All in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. The motion is carried. It will be held. Would you like to be recorded as voting no? No. Committee will now consideration RS 32713C1. Will you want Representative Moyle, or would you like Secretary McGrain? He's going to make him earn his keep today. Okay, Secretary McGrain. Explain to us the differences between the RS and the bill we just heard.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just to follow up, the distinctions on the bill we just heard in the RS I spoke to is the limits on the previous version were at $2,000. It's been dropped down to $1,500. There were $7,500 for candidates. It's been dropped down to $6,000. Similarly, the trigger has been moved to that $25,000. I will note that trigger that we just were discussing, that $25,000, that's true for all candidates, whether it's legislative, statewide, doesn't matter. All treated the same in that sense. The trigger is higher on how much negative IEs have to be spent, but the amount stays the same in terms of what contributions could be received. I think those, Speaker Moyle, is there any? I think those are the main distinctions between the RS and 3.
Any further questions? Representative Keeley's.
Yeah, just one question here, Mr. Chairman. So, Secretary McGrain, when you brought up those averages in terms of the different races, I mean, we've got a lot of uncontested races in the state. So what are the race averages in contested races versus uncontested ones? I think we've got sort of this two-tier funding problem depending on the status of the race.
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Keeley's, I don't know that I have numbers with me, but I don't know that I have that distinction in terms of contested versus uncontested. I have overall, and I think if you do look at our site, you're right. The dollars, right, we see some usually where we see is like leadership races. When I say that, not just like the speaker, but also chairmanship or others, there's more attention. And then there are other just, I don't know what districts get picked, but we see a few of them. I will know, so I've got the numbers that I have with me. So 87% of legislative contributions were below $1,000. I mentioned the medians at 200 for the primary, 100 for the general. In the primary, the average legislative candidate had 9 donors at 1,000. In the general, they had 4 donors at 1,000. I don't know in terms of races where it's uncontested versus contested races, though.
Representative Mickelson.
Secretary McGrain and Chairman, I'm wondering on page 12, if we move 50,000 down to 25, and then on page 13, line 9, if we moved the 25,000 down to 10, if that would be a friendly or unfriendly motion.
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Mickelson, Speaker, do you want to answer it or you want me to answer it? I think we have different opinions, so.
Give us both opinions. Give us yours and give us what
I'll attempt to give you both. I think if it's the Speaker Moyle, I think keeping him the same. I will say I personally hesitate lowering that first 25 or that first 50 down to 25. The lower you do it, the more races, I think, going to Representative Crane, you're going to open it up, the floodgates more and more to more races. That is a significant drop. Personally, I would prefer to see the second drop from 25 down to 10. 10 is still numerous times more. And I think there's a more comfort generally. I think, you know, when I was speaking with a senator, I won't mention, they said, you know, often they'll have constituents ask and say, well, is this person or group influencing your votes in the legislature? And they said, well, no one, anybody who gives me $100 or $1,000 is not changing how I determine. At $25,000, though, it gave this person a little bit of heartburn. And so, you know, I do, like I said, this is where the most discussion has been. So the second half, I support. The first half, not so much. I think the Speaker would probably say leave them both. Is that fair, Speaker? Go for it. Yeah. This is your turf.
You state your name for the record.
Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mike Moyle, District 10. What you're dealing with before you today is a problem that's going to get worse in Idaho if we don't figure out how to get some exposure to what's going on. Remember, the PACs are not constrained. You are. So you're effectively tying your hands and saying to these out-of-state or in-state PACs, spend as much as you want against me, but I can only get this much. So it goes back to what you were talking about, Representative Nicholson. If you take it from 25 to 10 on the second half, I'm okay with that. It's the will of the committee. Whatever you want, I'm good with that. But I think you need to give yourself some avenues when they attack you to respond. Representative Boyles had this happen to her before. Several of you at this committee have been close to that 50,000 mark. So I think the upper mark is important at 50, but if you want to lower the other one, that's the will of the committee. But again, I remind you, your hands are tied today. These out-of-state PACs can spend whatever they want against you, and you've got to go around and find money to go back. Think about my race, $500,000. I've got to find 500 people to give me $1,000 to compete with one guy in Texas that writes a check. It could happen to any of you. The other problem you have is your voters do not know what's coming in and who's paying for it. It's going on right now. It's called education, but it's really not. All of you have seen what's happening on Facebook, X, mailboxes, and everything else, text, voicemails. It's campaigning. And our voters need to know who's spending it and how much. We're not kind of constrained what they're doing. We're just trying to get the information out. And that's what we're trying to accomplish with this bill. So if you want to raise that 25 to 10, you can do that when you introduce the RS. That's your call. I will, whatever you want to do. I do think that the other one needs to stay high enough, though, that you don't pick up everything.
Any further questions for the speaker or for the secretary? Seeing none, the RS is properly before the committee. Representative Alfieri.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I would move to introduce RS 32713C1 and send it to the second reading calendar. And if I could just speak to that for a moment.
Sure.
And this is a monstrous piece of legislation here, and most of it is very good legislation. I don't know that we've got all the numbers right, or even the timing. I'm not sure about 48 hours reporting, if it should be 5 days, whatever. I'm not sure. But I think the test is in the market, and the market is to implement this and to see how it works. And likely we will be back next year with significant changes. But I think on the whole, this is a good piece of legislation, and we should give it our green light.
Representative Hostetler.
Thank you. To speak to that motion and make a substitute motion.
Sure.
This bill, speaking of heartburn, gives me a lot of heartburn. There's a huge Pandora's box here. I don't like going down the road of let's pass it and then come back retroactively and try to adjust when I have a lot of concerns. I don't think adjusting money does address the issue at hand either. I went against an opponent that outspent me by 3 times, and the current sunshine system was very sufficient to correlate outgoing votes to incoming money, if you will. But there's so many issues with this bill. Free speech and constitutional concerns, privacy, the growth of government, how it's going to be implemented, the enforcement mechanisms, the transparency and surveillance. I mean, I could go on the overall cost. There are so many issues that need to be addressed, I really think, and honed down first, or even split up into different bills. I could not support this going to the floor, let alone on the floor. So I'd make a motion to hold it in committee.
So the proper motion, Representative, would be return to sponsor.
Return to sponsor?
Okay.
Yes, sir. Please. That's my motion.
Committee, we have a substitute motion to turn RS 32713C1 to sponsor. Is there discussion on that motion or the original motion? Representative Dygert.
Thank you, Representative Crane. I'll be supporting the original motion to send this to to introduce it and to send it to second reading calendar. Pandora's box is already open and it's already flowing, and there's some crazy things happening. And I look at these limits and I don't have donors that'll ever reach the $25,000 if $50,000 was ever spent, opposing me on independent expenditures. However, there are people that would come in with an extra 50 or 100 or 500. And so, changing those without limiting some of the races that are going to get that kind of attention and perhaps have that kind of opportunity. The concept of an individual being able to defend themselves against the kind of things that have been said and put out there is pretty paramount. And so I'll be supporting their original motion.
Thank you, Representative Dygert. Further discussion on the motions. Representative Boyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could I ask the Secretary a question?
Secretary of State McGrain, would you yield for question? Representative Boyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary, on page 12, I'm just a little confused about this wording. When we go to line 43, where it says, all candidates in any race shall be permitted to accept contributions in excess if the independent expenditures are made in opposition to the candidate. Are you talking about all the candidates in a certain race if one candidate is in excess?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Boyle, good question. Yes, it's to a specific race, not to all different races, but it's to say if there's a four-way race, say there's four candidates, that this would apply to all four candidates. In an earlier version, there was concerns that it would only apply to the one person, and it's to say, no, if we're going to raise the limits on one of the candidates, it should still be even and fair. We don't want to tie one candidate's hands versus the other. Yeah, thank you.
Further discussion on the motion. Representative Achilles.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make an amended substitute motion.
Shoot, it's a Monday morning. Why not?
Well, we have a 40-page bill here, so
you must not have had your coffee this morning.
Specifically on page 13, line 9, as we've been discussing, I would propose we change $25,000 to $10,000. And if I may, I'd like to explain the amended substitute motion.
Certainly.
And I think going back to Representative Tiger's point, if there's an IE opposing you that breaches that $50,000 cap and we increase the limits, remember that increases the limits for both candidates, all candidates in the race. So a big out-of-state group that can pay enough to pass that 50,000 cap can certainly cut a $25,000 check against you. So it just goes from bad to worse, is my concern in this. And at least if we lower that cap a little bit, I think it levels the playing field for, the representative from Owyhee County or the representative from Northwest Boise in terms of being able to stand up to some of these folks that can cut some big checks. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Committee, we have a motion to introduce RS 327, an amended substitute motion to introduce RS 32713C1. And on page 13, line 9, striking the word 25 and replacing that with 10, and also the numerical value of 25 and replacing that with 10. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Nay. The motion is carried. It will be done. Would you like to be recorded as voting no? Sure. Representative Scott on the record voting no. Representative Barbieri on the record voting no. Representative Palmer on the record voting no. Committee will now consideration RS 32734. Representative Moyle.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, Mike Moyle, District 10. I'll talk about this really quick. A few years ago, you saw us talk about absentee ballots, and we talked about, how they were being used, how they were being funneled around, how people were bringing them in and handing them out. I've always had concerns with absentee ballots. I've always wanted to make sure whoever sends the absentee ballot in is the person that it's their ballot and that they voted for it. What this RS does is requires a change in the way we do absentee ballots. Currently, when you get your absentee ballot, you vote, you put it in the envelope, and you sign the outside of the envelope, and you send it back. This will change that and kind of add another envelope. That's why it's got a $4,000 cost. What will happen is when you sign, after you vote and put your envelope in that secret envelope, it'll be on the inside where people can't see your information, and you'll have to add to it your signature, your driver's license or ID number that you're using for that ballot, your last four of your social security number, your date of birth. Why do we want all those things? Because that's what you have now on your driver's license, right? It's all in there. That's what we require on other items to prove who you are when you vote. But we don't do that with absentee ballots. We just have a signature. This gives the clerk the information they need to verify you're who you say you are. But we need to have a new envelope so it's in the inside, so it's not accessible to the public when they're looking at that when you send it in. When we talk about absentee ballots, we want to keep them safe. We want to keep them secure. We want to make sure whoever sends that thing back in is the person that's supposed to vote in that ballot. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Thank you. Are there questions for Representative Moyle? Seeing none, Representative Alfieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. One of the concerns with this legislation was that we now have another step for the county clerks. How is that addressed? Did they get to open the ballots a few more days in advance, or how is this going to work?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Alfieri, they would like that opportunity, but remember that information will be on the outside of the ballot like it is today, and they can't open until Election Day. That was one of the concerns that came from some of our clerks. They'd like to open the ballots earlier. I know that's a concern that I have and the Chairman Crane have, and so we left it so that inner envelope where the ballot is, they can see that, but they're not opening and counting the ballots yet. They're just making sure, like they do now, that that signature and that information is the individual that's supposed to have that ballot and voted that ballot.
Follow-up?
So just to clarify, we're opening the outside envelope, but not the inside envelope. We're not counting the ballot itself, but we're looking at the information on that second envelope.
Speaker
Is that
Moore.
right?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, absolutely. So that, and it's outside of the public's purview. Today, it's on the outside, it's just a signature. And if you think you can look at my signature and see it's really me, it changes every day. My point being, now you have all the information to make sure that you have their driver's license, date of birth, you have everything to know that they are who they say they are when they voted that ballot, but it's on the inside where the clerk can look at it before they open the ballot to count it.
And when we're just for motion, sir, to send this to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
What's an RS?
Introduce and
Introduce.
send it to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
Are you not wanting a hearing on this? You want to send it straight to second reading?
Yes, sir.
A motion is to introduce RS 32734 and send to the second reading calendar. Further questions for the speaker? Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, I wasn't aware that our social security numbers were being collected by the clerk. How is that? Is that the case? They're collecting our social security numbers?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, some people, when they register to vote, use the last four of their social security. If you read the bill, it's only the last four of their social security. It's not their whole social security number. It's just the last four. So you have individuals, that's the information that the clerk has on them, just those last four social security numbers and a signature.
Follow up?
Mr. Chairman, I think this needs a little bit better vetting. I make a substitute motion that we just introduce this bill. I think we need to discuss a little bit further how the process is going to work and dig into this just for a minute longer.
Okay. Substitute motion is to introduce RS 32734. Further questions for Speaker Moyle? Representative Mickelson.
Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman, I guess my concern is, so we're going to have 3 envelopes that go back. We're going to have the outside envelope. We're going to have the inner envelope that has all this information on it, and then we're going to have the inner envelope that has the ballot in it.
Mr. Chairman and Representative, it depends on what they decide to do. The Secretary of State and the clerks will get together to do that. You could do it with 2 envelopes if you have the inner one that has the ballot in it, but it needs to be separate and where the public can't see this information. Today, you put it in the envelope, you sign the envelope. And when the clerks get it, they open it, it's there. This could entail another envelope, but it could just be one if they put it on the inside and it's covered from the public view. You don't want the public to see your driver's license number and all that stuff.
Follow up?
Mr. Speaker and Mr. Chairman, I guess my concern is if we're going to put all this extra information on the outside of that envelope, then what protects that envelope from being stolen or being used? I mean, I think it's a security issue in that respect, but then I also question the amount of information a clerk's going to have to verify, and they're going to have to do it on the very day that they're trying to count all the other ballots. Is there a way for them to be able to verify this information beforehand, before they open up the ballot? Because you're talking social security number, driver's license, all this stuff. When I go to vote, I don't have to verify my social security number and everything in addition to my driver's license and to who I am.
Mr. Chairman, remember when you go to vote, you're probably scanning your driver's license or your state-issued ID. All that information is there. Your date of birth's on there. All that stuff is there. This puts it on the inside, but it requires you also to have more information. Think about, how do we know, how does the clerk really know that you did the ballot if you sign it? I could put an X on that and I guarantee it gets counted. The clerk needs to be able to identify that that ballot came from Representative Nicholson and that that really is Representative Nicholson. That's why you've got to have that information. The clerk can verify without opening the ballot and counting the ballot too. Because remember, there's two different steps. The ballot's inside that envelope with your information like it is today, and it doesn't get opened until Election Day. Once it's verified that it's you with a signature today, this gives them more information to make sure it is you. So I don't think it will add to that. It just puts more information on there that the clerk can verify that you really are who you are, say you are.
Representative Keeley's.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Speaker, so I guess I still struggle on these absentee voter bills that we've had come through here. I still haven't seen any hard numbers on the actual number of fraudulent absentee ballots. So we had 182,000 absentee ballots in the last cycle, and maybe the Secretary McGrain can answer this, but how many were failed and corrected? Because I know the clerks will call the voter if there's an error on the absentee. How many were failed and not corrected? And then how many were just overtly fraudulent, and what are the Secretary's office do about that?
Speaker Moyle.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I don't know the answer to that, but remember, we're not talking about the ballot on the inside. We're not talking if you messed up and voted for two people. We're not talking about all that. That's inside the envelope. I just want to make sure you're who you say you are when you sent the ballot in. And that's what we're trying to get. We're trying to make sure that people that are sending those absentee ballots are whoever they say they are, and to be able to verify that, in my humble opinion, you need more than a signature, because a signature can change. We need to know your information, just like when you, Representative Nicholson, went to vote, they had your driver's license, they had your date of birth, they had your driver's license, they had your picture, they had everything. This doesn't have a picture with it, but it has the number and the corresponding information to make sure you're who you say you are.
Follow-up?
Yeah. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But, Mr. Speaker, the ballot is mailed to somebody's home. The voter pulls that ballot out of the mailbox, they complete it, they sign it, they send it back. I guess I'm still trying to understand how many of those. I mean, we're talking about making some significant changes here. We're basically going from one piece of data, two pieces of data. We'll say it's the address and the signature, to what's effectively 6 pieces of data: the address, the signature, the driver's license number, the last 4 of the social security number, and the date of birth. So when we add all that data into the decision-making process on if a ballot's correct or not, we're going to suddenly introduce basically false negatives. It just takes one sloppy number on the driver's license to throw that ballot out, or to increase the work of the clerks to be able to do this. And my signature's awful, and my handwriting's even worse. So I'm really concerned that this is going to send us in the wrong direction and end up suppressing votes when we're just trying to validate who sent the ballot in.
Well, I made him leave off your mother's maiden name as well as the firstborn child's name.
Thank you.
Speaker Moyle.
Mr. Chairman, Representative, are you kidding me? We're talking about voting. Right now, I can put an X on there, my vote counts. If we want to make sure that these votes are legitimate, that these are the people they say they are, then we need to have the information to the clerk so they can verify. These envelopes are destroyed after the vote's done, but you need to make sure that the X is really Representative Achilles. The address, if you go look, you're going to find some absentee ballots that go to addresses that don't exist because they're in the military or something else, or the house has been destroyed, but they're still voting. I want to make sure that when you send that absentee ballot back, that you're who you say you are, just like when I go in person and they check my driver's license, and all that information you're worried about is already there. And I also have to have a signature too. Remember, you're signing when you get there on the roll book. You've got your driver's license, you've got your date of birth. All that information is there for the clerk or the representative to look out when you vote. But if I vote absentee, I can put an X and send it back. That's a problem. I think the clerk needs to have all the information to verify who you say you are.
Are you on that final slot? I've got an amended substitute motion slot open.
Here we go.
Representative Keeley.
Only one per month.
Well, you already had one this morning. I was going to give you 2.
No, I guess, Mr. Speaker, if you put an X on it, that's not going to be accepted. A clerk's not going to accept that if the valid signature is already there. And I mean, I've worked enough elections on cold mornings when people can barely hold a pen, and you can still work through it. I think the impact of this is going to be to suppress the vote. And I'm really concerned that all of this extra verification, and there's nowhere in the voting process do we require the last four of the social security number, even when you show up in person, right? It's just scanning the driver's license and making sure the addresses match. So I will move to support a print on this, Mr. Chairman, but I do think we need more data and more conversation around it.
Thank you, Representative Keeley.
Let me
Would you like
answer
to
that
respond?
question really quick. Remember, there was a day that you could go online and register to vote with your name, a signature, and the last four of your social security. There are a lot of people that are registered today that the only information the clerk has is the last four of their social security. That's what we used to do. That's why that's included in that. That was how you could do it online and everything else. If you were ever at your fair booth in the fair and registering voters, it was the last four. And I don't know if your last four are right, or I could make them up. I don't know how to verify that. Hence the reason you need the other information to make sure they
Representative
collaborate.
Pahalka.
I remember when my social security number used to be on my checks. Anyway, years ago. So real quick, I've always just go vote. But anyway, those that send in absentee, I notice on my driver's license it says Michael. And I don't know if this is more of a comment or maybe a question, but so when I went in to vote, I gave my driver's license and they're looking through and pretty soon they go, well, we can't find you. And unfortunately, instead of Michael, they had me under Mike under the automation. So we just have to make sure whatever they have, Michael, Mike, that Rob, that everything would be clear when they would mail that in. So I guess that's more of a comment than anything, but I think it's a good thing myself. Thank you.
Thank you. And Mr. Chairman, that's what's going on now, and Representative Keeley's brought it up. When there's some coordination or the information doesn't match, the clerks generally call to make sure. And we have good clerks. Our clerks do an amazing job.
Representative Barbieri.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I ask unanimous consent that I withdraw my substitute motion.
Committee, there's a unanimous consent request to withdraw the substitute motion to just introduce RS 32734, which leaves us with the original motion. Is there objection to that? Representative Nicholson.
I think we actually need to have, I don't have a problem with Representative Barbieri pulling his thing, but I do
There's
think.
no objection.
No objection to that, but I do think we need to have a hearing before we.
Well, then you're going
send
to have to do a substitute motion again for the same thing because he doesn't
Okay,
want to do that.
I have a substitute motion. I object. I object to him removing his
Okay.
motion.
You object. Thank you.
There you go. Compass, same thing.
Further discussion. Committee, the motion is to introduce RS 32734. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay. Nay. The motion is carried and it will be done. And Speaker, I think you got some work on the committee to do.
Yeah, I think so too. Thank you, committee.
All right, final one of the day is House Bill 398. Representative Skog.
Chairman, Committee, Bruce Skog, District 10, Star, Middleton, and Nampa areas. For a personal privilege, if I may, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to introduce my mother here in the front row. She's from the Little Bear River. She's on 40 acres in Utah, and she's been off the grid for 25 years, so she's tough. And she asked me who's going to be opposing my bills today. So just let you know.
You've raised a fine son, and you should be very proud of yourself.
All right, now let's get to the bill. This legislation is the second part in reorganizing the sunshine laws that our good Secretary of State has already talked about. Currently, campaign finance requirements are intertwined with lobbying requirements, and it is quite confusing if you're trying to go through that as a legislator or as someone involved in the process or a citizen just opening up the book and trying to read it. So we're trying to clean that up. The reorganization does not make any substantive changes except what I'm going to go through and talk to you about now. So definition of lobbying, indirect lobbying, it adds a clear definition for what constitutes indirect lobbying. You can find that in 74701. Indirect lobbying is already captured in Idaho code, but this definition makes it better. Quote, indirect contacts and attempts to influence legislation by attempting to affect the opinion of the public with respect to legislation and encouraging the audience to take action with respect to the legislation, unquote. It specifies things like email, text messaging, direct messaging, billboards, door-to-door, radio, TV, online ads, and social media. The reporting, this is a change in 74705 in the bill. and sub 1 requires monthly reporting for all registered lobbyists year-round. That's a change. It's year-round because lobbying is taking place year-round. It requires in 74705 sub 4, 48-hour reporting for indirect lobbying expenditures $100 or more. The 48-hour clock starts at the earlier of when the lobbyist pays for it or the expenditure is distributed or viewed by the public. This is in addition to regular reporting. In 74706, state entities, this now includes universities. You know, our universities lobby quite a bit, and they aren't required to report the subject of their lobbying efforts on this is for bills, rules, just as everyone else has to do. So it levels them up to the other lobbyists. Under current law, they only report expenditures. Universities lobby numerous policy issues and bills without disclosure. That's going to change with this bill, and one of the reasons I strongly support it. Duties of the lobbyist, 74708 in this bill, requires a paid-for statement for any public communication sent by a lobbyist or an organization with a registered lobbyist. Also, if applicable, the organization must also include that the communication, quote, is an attempt to solicit funds, unquote. So with that, I stand for questions, or rather our good Secretary of State stands for questions, and I ask that you send this to the floor with a due pass.
Thank you. He is signed up to testify as well. Representative Scott.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative Skog, my question is about the lobbyist fee. $10. It seems like really not very high, especially when to even run for a campaign, it costs more than that. Was there any idea? I mean, did you look at that number, and why did you stick with $10 to register as a lobbyist?
Representative Skog.
Chairman Crane, Representative Scott, I'm going to defer to the Secretary on that, if I may.
Certainly. Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, as you can probably tell from the earlier conversation, we put a ton of effort and months of work into the campaign finance piece. Honestly, this piece really resembles the current law overall. It's just moving it in terms of, and I think Representative Skog touched on it, so we haven't changed very many things other than responding to some of the feedback that leadership and legislators. So we had not looked at the specific fee. I don't have strong feelings, but the $10 has been there for a while.
Representative Hostetler.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For a quick question to whoever is more ready to answer. This bill, much like the last, to me, has just a lot of concerns. Probably the multiple pages first. But that being said, indirect lobbying, can you help explain that a little bit more? It says shall include but not limited to, and then it goes into some explanation. But who makes that decision? Can you just explain that a little bit more, the indirect lobbying and how that will be enforced? Who makes the decision? What else that could include?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hostetler, I appreciate the question. And that really at the core of this, that indirect lobbying piece is a key component of why you see this bill before you. So the multiple pages, I'll just answer. It's because we're moving the entire lobbying code. That's why most of it's the exact same. The indirect lobbying, when everyone thinks of lobbying, they generally think of, there's plenty of people with green tags behind me, right? They think of someone taking them to lunch or going to one of the receptions. That's his historical, we'll call direct lobbying, where someone meets with you, has a conversation. The only part that we regulate, and I think it's worth noting because not everyone's familiar, our office regulates lobbyists, and we make sure they do financial disclosure reports, and we have a website dedicated to their reports, just like we do for campaign finance, but it's all focused on lobbying. We've seen just in the past few years a rise in what we're referring to as indirect lobbying. Instead of approaching you directly, Representative Hostetler, and saying, hey, how can I win your vote or whatnot, instead we're seeing text messages to your constituents or mailers in your district. And so they're not actually appealing to you directly, they're indirectly trying to appeal to you by saying, please contact Representative Hostetler and tell him to vote yes or no on whatever the issue may be. And we've seen a significant rise in that, specifically mailings, text messages, door knocking, social media posts. And so this is to clarify. I think this is us adapting. Again, these laws were written in the 70s as well. And so it's us trying to get up to the current climate in terms of activities. And I will say we're seeing and this, I guess, is part of my testimony, Mr. Chairman, but a huge increase in the amount of money being spent. So just in the first 2 months of this legislative session, we've seen hundreds of thousands of dollars spent on lobbying, overwhelmingly on indirect lobbying, not direct lobbying.
Follow up? You good? Okay. Representative Dygert.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I think I found what I was looking for in the exemptions from registration. I was worried about when we get a lot of individuals from nonprofits or other groups that receive no compensation, but they're just here, they're more advocating more than lobbying. They're exempt. Am I reading that part right?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Dygert, yes, that's correct. You have to receive compensation of more than $250 for the purposes of influencing legislative or executive officials to be required to register. So the average citizen coming down here meeting with you, or dedicated constituent nonprofit, is not impacted.
Any further questions for the Secretary? Representative Keeley's.
So, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, if a university was lobbying on behalf of, let's just say it's the Association of Idaho Universities, would they still be required to report, if I'm reading the exemption section correctly?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Keeley's, I'm going to have to think that one through. We do have, so it's been a while that we have a state entity reporting. So it's very similar to lobbying. They're just not registered lobbyists, and we do have them report. The change, as Representative Skog noted, is they currently don't have to identify which issues that they're doing. So this is putting them more even on the same reporting. If they were lobbying on behalf of an entity like that, they might need to register for that entity if they were doing it. I haven't seen the activity that you're describing. So they usually are just on behalf of the organization they are employed by.
Further questions? See, Representative, I knew there was one in there. I knew there was another one.
I had to work it out.
All right.
Mr. Chairman. I'm just curious, once again, back to the indirect lobbying, shall include but not be limited to influencing the public. Let's say there is a fair and someone sets up a booth, right? We saw that a lot during or before Prop 1. How does that come into play? Do they have to pre-register? Is there someone that's going to hold them accountable if they don't? Something of that nature. Would that be included in this? It's just
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Hotseller, I think you're asking a good question because we have both campaign finance and we have lobbying. Most of us intuitively go to the campaign finance realm. And the example you're mentioning probably fits more in the campaign finance side, like Prop 1 or the campaign's advocacy in that sense. We're seeing, and part of this legislation is we're seeing campaign tactics brought into the realm of lobbying. There are differences both in terms of the regulation, but also what the intent is. The intent on the campaign side is to help whatever's on the ballot. Here, it's not to focus on what's on the ballot, it's to focus on a bill that is before you. And so this is just saying if someone's using some of those same tactics, so social media ads or whatever, they should do it. That broad language that you've referenced is really just to encompass that our office is not sufficiently creative to come up with all the means that people will try to do indirect lobby people. So it's just a catch-all to say, like, if it is that, then you do need to report what you're spending. I want to emphasize, this doesn't stop anybody from doing anything. This just says you must disclose when you are doing and spending money trying to influence legislators.
Any further questions for the Secretary? Seeing none, thank you, Secretary. Only person I have signed up besides the Secretary was Jonathan Oppenheimer. Is there anyone in the audience that would like to testify? Jonathan, take us away.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate the chance to testify. For the record, my name is Jonathan Oppenheimer. I serve as the Government Relations Director for the Idaho Conservation League. I'm pleased to stand here for the good representative's mother in particular to support this bill. I just want to make that clear. Don't want any trouble in the hallway. As a 501c3 nonprofit organization, the Idaho Conservation League engages as a lobbyist. We have had a staff lobbyist ever since our founding in 1973. Little bit of Idaho Conservation League history. It was some of our work in the 1974 session and the frustration that we had over the rejection of the Land Use Planning Act and all of the funding from some of the commercial interests that really buried that bill, that the first husband of the Idaho Conservation League, a guy by the name of Ken Persley, was married to our executive director, drafted the Sunshine Act and brought it forward. So the Idaho Conservation League is a huge supporter of government transparency and disclosure, and we are happy to follow the terms of whatever statute that does come forward. But one of the concerns that I did want to raise is that the U.S. Supreme Court has found that if you're going to put limits on free speech, that there has to be sufficient governmental interest in appropriately tailored responses and approaches. And this, I think, is really key, because the last thing I want to see happen is for the legislature to pass this and then to realize, we went too far. And if I could just indulge the committee and maybe take a couple extra seconds, the indirect lobbying threshold of $100 that requires a 48-hour report. The Idaho Conservation League, as likely comes as no surprise if you've been on our website, read our emails, oftentimes we will have a little take action at the bottom of an email that says, hey, here's an issue, something that is happening with the state, possibly with Congress, that would be separate and apart from this reporting, but oftentimes during the session in the Statehouse. And we will say, hey, contact your legislators, because we know at the end of the day, you would rather hear from your constituents on issues than you would from me. I can speak from experience knowing that to be true. You prefer to hear from the people who vote for you. And so I think that's the key, is this kind of balancing of the harm and the approach. Is if you're requiring a 48-hour report for a $100 expenditure, when it comes down to it, I believe, and we are going to do a full audit at the Idaho Conservation League to figure out exactly how much do we spend per email, because we do have staff that are working on that. We pay for databases, and so we want to follow the law. The last thing that I do want to mention, which is important, this may be able to be caught by bill drafters, but I believe there is a typo in this section. On page 11, line 15. Page 11, line 15, it says that you must report an expenditure is made on the day that the public commination paid by the expenditure is made. Now, I think that's supposed to say communication, and again, maybe the editors can catch that afterwards. Commination is actually a word. I looked it up, and what it means, and I don't think that the speaker has this power, but it is the action of threatening divine vengeance.
Do you know Speaker Moyle?
Mr. Chairman, I do, and
it may not have been a typo.
I beg leave not to answer that question.
That's fine. We do have a provision in our rule that allows, if it's just a typographical error, we can fix that, so we will get with the clerk and get that changed.
So I would just want to confirm, if I might interrupt, with the sponsor and the good secretary, that they did not mean to invoke the spirit of divine vengeance as part of this measure.
Are there questions for Jonathan? Seeing none, thank you, Jonathan, for your testimony. Secretary McGrain, you're the other one signed up to testify. Do you want to testify? You're comfortable? Okay. Yeah, Representative Scott.
I have a question. It could be for Secretary McGrain.
Okay.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary McGrain, my question is about executive lobbyists and how they fit in with this legislation. And could you touch on that, if they're even covered under this?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, I'm going to have you clarify on.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Representative McGrain, the red tags, I guess, the people that work for the executive agencies, the heads of executive agencies, and their attempts to influence legislators on legislation or policy. Does this cover them at all?
Secretary McGrain.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Scott, I think the general answer is going to be no for what you're referring to. So one of the things is, to one of the earlier questions, this covers those who are compensated for the purpose of lobbying, but also it requires money to be spent on lobbying. Just talking to a legislator about policy is not covered for anybody. So when a lobbyist just talks to you in the hall, even if they are a registered lobbyist, there's nothing that they report. It's only when they expend funds to influence you. So it's the lunch, the reception or whatnot. So just having members of the executive branch, elected officials are exempt from the lobbying requirements. The one distinction there, and I think this maybe partly goes to your question, is those state entities reporting that Representative Skog mentioned. The easy ones are the university. So if the university spends money, so they take you to a football game, hypothetically, right? That they have to report because they're behaving so much like lobbyists that years ago we changed it and said, now, but as long as the state entity, like a an executive branch official isn't spending money to influence you, even if they were private, they wouldn't have to report, and they don't have to report anything. So their mere presence in the halls is not regulated by this, just this expenditure of funds.
Any further questions for the Secretary? Seeing none, thank you, Secretary. Committee, that's all I have signed up to testify today. There was no negative testimony, Representative Skog, so you're welcome to take your seat. Committee, House Bill 398 is properly before the committee. Representative Barbieri.
Mr. Chairman, I move that we send House Bill 398 to the floor with a due pass recommendation.
Committee, we have a motion to send House Bill 398 to the floor with a due pass recommendation. Is there discussion on that motion? Seeing none, all in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed, nay? Nay. The motion is carried. It will be done. Would you like to be recorded as voting no? Sure. Representative Hostetler on the record voting no. Representative Scott voting no. Committee, that completes our work for today. We'll stand adjourned.
This bill, I think, it puts a stake in the ground that says we have a sovereign right to protect what's ours.